Revolutionaries, this is our video for week 12, day 2. Our subject is Putin's political revolution, and our teaching assistant is taking a break, so no cat for us today. I apologize for posting this video rather late. It's now Saturday. I just had a very busy week, lots and lots of meetings. I fell behind on things, so I do apologize for that, and obviously I don't expect you to get your responses up by Friday because Friday already came and went. So just do the best you can to respond to this video in your own time. Hopefully the time that you were not having video number 2 this week, you were able to spend working on your papers. All right, just a couple of quick announcements. Your 3-page rough drafts of your final papers were due on Friday. I only got 4 of them so far. Obviously, I am not going to penalize you if you didn't get your rough draft in on time. That's been our principle this whole, quarantine part of the semester. But I do encourage you to get those in as quickly as possible. Go ahead and submit them on Sakai as soon as you can, because as soon as I have your draft, I can give you written comments on it and turn that back around to you, and then you'll have those comments to use as you're working towards the final draft of your paper. If you have any questions on the paper, anything about the assignment, anything that comes up as you're working on it, please do email me. And keep in mind that if at any time between now and May 10th, which is when the paper is due, if you have questions, if you want to meet with me, if you want to send me another rough draft, I am happy to interact with all of that stuff. Just email and let me know. Okay, looking ahead, we have just 2 more days of content after this one. We're doing Putin's social revolution and Putin's cultural revolution in week 13. Week 13, day 1, the social revolution day, is the last day that we have pretty substantial content. So if you are pressed for time, I would like you to focus on reading Anne Garrell's Putin Country. We have 4 chapters from that. Each chapter is rather short. There are also 2 other short articles. If you don't have time for everything, focus on the Garrells. The last day of class, we are scheduled to discuss the revolution's timeline. So here's what I would like to do. I'd like to do an in-person, real-time class date so we can all see each other one more time, talk about the revolution's timeline, talk about our other big takeaways from the semester. So if you are available, please sign into Teams at 2:20 on May 4th. That is our scheduled last day of class. I'll send you an invitation for Teams so that we can all get together in the same space. And we'll just have that conversation and have a sort of a last hurrah together. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you then. All right, today we are launching our mini unit on Putin's Russia. When we left off last time, Yeltsin was in charge, the ruble had crashed, and everything was kind of falling apart. One of Yeltsin's major blunders was the First Chechen War, in which Chechnya tried to gain its independence from Russia, and Russia fought back in a very bloody but not very effective way. This war ended, or at least paused, with a ceasefire in 1996. Something important to note is that between 94 and 96, this was a nationalist war. The Chechens were fighting for their independence the same way that, say, the Latvians would have if Gorbachev had not accepted their secession decree in 1990. Let's see. After the ceasefire, though, Russia did not commit resources to rebuilding Chechnya. They kind of came in and leveled everything and left it how it was. Partly that's because Russia didn't have the budget, but much more it was because Russia didn't really think it was a priority. So that created an opportunity for Islamist militants from elsewhere to start infiltrating into the province of Chechnya and getting recruits. So consequently, when the Second Chechen War began in the fall of 1999, it took on the character of a holy war. It was a different war, different type of war. The previous war was a nationalist war. Second Chechen War was much more of a religious war. And that allowed Putin to frame Russia as a partner of the US and other countries in the so-called War on Terror. So officially the Second Chechen War ended in 2000, but there is a sense in which it is still going on all this time later, in the sense that there is constant low-level guerrilla fighting in Chechnya, and there are periodically terrorist attacks committed by Chechens elsewhere in Russia. It's worth considering these events within the framework of Imperial Russia's long war to conquer the Caucasus in the first place, which we encountered in this class through Pushkin's Prisoner of the Caucasus and Tolstoy's Haji Murat. Okay, Putin took over from Yeltsin in a manner that is hard to characterize as democratic. As you read, Yeltsin stepped down in December 1999 when he was really drunk and it was pretty clear to everybody that he couldn't continue on. And that meant that Putin had advanced to the presidency just a little bit before the 2000 presidential election. So he was elected, but he was kind of already in the job. So he then won easily, and he pardoned Yeltsin for all of the corruption that had made Yeltsin so unpopular by that point. Publicly, Putin framed himself as everything Yeltsin was not. Strong, stable, sober, the guy who was going to return Russia to its rightful position as a world power. And indeed, during his first 2 terms, the economy stabilized and grew significantly. The standard of living went up, although stratification remained. Crime went down, and government proceeded a lot more smoothly, thanks to new laws that pushed out minority parties. So as Tony Wood explains, foreign policy remained a challenge, particularly around the flashpoints of Ukraine's 2004 Orange Revolution and the brief 2008 Russo-Georgian War. But even during these events, Putin has managed to maintain the image domestically of a strong leader who stands up to threats from abroad. And of course, that's going to play a major role in our discussion today. At the same time, Putin has cracked down significantly on freedom of speech and other civil liberties. He helped Kremlin-friendly oligarchs gain control of major media outlets, and he went after independent journalists. In 2006, NGOs that received funding from international sources were compelled to register as foreign agents, and that has had a significant chilling effect. A new protest movement began in 2012 when Putin announced that he would be running for president again. So Putin was elected in 2000 and then in 2004. And then in 2008, he ran out of his legal limit of 2 consecutive terms. And to the surprise of some commentators, actually, he did step down. But in his place, his prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, ran for president. And when Medvedev won, which was never really in doubt, Medvedev appointed Putin as prime minister, and they operated as a tandem. So they basically switched jobs for 4 years, and then they switched back. So during those 4 years of Medvedev's presidency, the Duma changed the constitution to make the presidential term 6 years, but they maintained that 2-term limit. So when Putin announced he was running again in 2008, the prospect of 12 more years of Putin, that was enough to get protesters out in the street for the first time since 1991. Putin still won the election. Again, this was never in doubt. And he won a 2nd term in 2018. But despite the new restrictions on free speech and the murder of opposition leader Boris Nemtsov in 2015, the protest movement has not gone away. And some of those oppositional movements are things we're going to be looking at next week as well. So this brings us to a point that I think is really important, though often hard for Americans to understand. Russians know that they do not have a democracy, right? They're not confused about what democracy is. They know what democracy is, and they know that what they have doesn't really fit that standard. And a lot of them are really bothered by this. But at the same time, after Russia's experiences in the 1990s, both domestically and internationally, many Russians have come to feel that real democracy either isn't worth it or is a luxury that they simply cannot afford. So the only stability and national pride they have experienced since the fall of the Soviet Union has come during Putin's presidency. The persistence of protests seems to indicate that that may be starting to change, but it hasn't done so yet. And hopefully today's sources will help us understand this situation more in depth. I thought it also might be helpful to fill out some of the background on Russia's annexation of Crimea, since that's our primary source today is Putin's speech about that annexation. So as Tony Wood explains, Ukraine spent the 90s and 2000s pulling back and forth between Russia and Western Europe. In 2013, Ukraine's pro-Western president negotiated an association agreement with the European Union, and this was understood as a sort of a preliminary step to joining the European Union. But that November 2013, he lost the election for president to a pro-Russian candidate. There are complicated reasons for that we can't get into. But when the new pro-Russian president announced Ukraine's withdrawal from the association agreement, pro-Western protesters took over the Maidan Square in Kiev. And that protest lasted from November 2013 until February 2014. Now, you know they were serious because the winter is really, really cold in Kiev, and these guys stayed on the street protesting during the worst months of it. And then in February 2014, in response to police violence against the protesters, the Ukrainian parliament voted to depose the president. He fled to Russia, and without him, Ukraine quickly took on a new caretaker government and moved back into the EU's sphere of influence. The day after the president was deposed in February 2014, Russia sent troops into the Crimean Peninsula, which has a large population of ethnic Russians, and perhaps more importantly, it is home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet at the naval base of Sevastopol. Soon after, the quote-unquote Republic of Crimea held a referendum on joining the Russian Federation. Most people who were against it protested by refusing to vote. So that means that the measure was overwhelmingly approved. The statistics that Putin gives in his speech are accurate, but we need to take into account that a large number of people refused to vote. They protested by not voting in the referendum. So then, shortly after that, rebels in 2 provinces in eastern Ukraine, in the region known as the Donbass, they began fighting to secede from Ukraine and join Russia as well. And Russia has supported them through various covert means, and those conflicts are still ongoing. Ukraine is still basically in a civil war. Throughout all of this, Ukraine expected help from the West. After all, the EU had been sort of courting them for some time. And while there has been some saber-rattling and some economic sanctions, it's become clear that NATO and the EU are not willing to intervene militarily. So Russia basically has gotten to keep Crimea, and all of this has created a huge boost in ratings for Putin at home, as has Russia's intervention in Syria, which Wood describes in some detail, so I won't go into that here. One last note on Putin's political revolution. In 2008, Putin was not willing to change the constitution to stay in power, as I mentioned before. But his 2-term limit is coming up again in 2024. This January, so like these events are happening all around us, this January, Putin announced that there would be a referendum on some amendments to the Russian constitution, including one that consolidates the authority of the state council, which has previously just been an advisory body. Russia watchers suspect that Putin is planning to have himself installed as the head of that state council, and then he can continue to basically run the country indefinitely without being subject to further elections. So once again, he's willing to tweak the Constitution but not violate it in order to stay in power. And that's something we all just need to continue to keep an eye on. Okay, time for some discussion questions. Number 1. Tony Wood's main argument in Chapter 1 is that while Putin has managed to create an extraordinary political system in Russia over the past 20 years, this managed democracy is best understood as a continuation of processes that began with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So what evidence does Wood use to make this argument? Does he convince you? Why or why not? If he's right, then is Putin not really a political revolutionary at all? Or should we conceptualize his political revolution in a different way? If Putin's presidency does represent a maturation of the system that developed under Yeltsin, then why has he worked so hard to promote himself as the anti-Yeltsin? Number 2. From 2000 to 2008, Putin combined a shrinking of political freedoms with a surprisingly strong commitment to abiding by the Russian constitution. When he won the presidency again in 2012, many Russia watchers wondered if it would be the end of term limits and regular elections. But it hasn't been, and even now, despite the changes to the constitution proposed in January, Putin continues to maintain the framework of legality and legitimacy around his presidency. So in your analysis, why does he bother with that? Why does he keep finding creative ways to stay in power that don't violate the letter of the Russian constitution? Number 3. Wood points out that Putin's economic policies combine neoliberal privatization with a strong role for the state, creating what economists have called an upstairs-downstairs economy. How do the states and private interests work together in this model? How does it respond to the difficulties of the 1990s and promote economic growth while ensuring stability? What makes this model so desirable for Putin as a proponent of managed democracy? Do you think this model can work indefinitely, or will these interests eventually conflict? Number 4. In Chapter 5, Wood places a certain amount of blame for the current breakdown in relations between Russia and the West on the West itself. He's not saying it's entirely the West's fault, but he's saying the West could have done a better job. The US's drive to expand NATO into Eastern Europe and create a unipolar world order alienated Russia, which still thought of itself as a great power and expected to be treated that way. In your analysis, how could the West have done a better job in its approach to European geopolitics and avoid the adversarial situation that we see today? Would it have been possible in the long term to harness the goodwill of the 1990s and keep Russia as an ally rather than an enemy? Consider Putin's political persona and his political goals in making your answer. Number 5. Wood argues that Russia's actions in Ukraine in the last few years have not been the result of long-held political goals, and in fact they're not even really about Ukraine at all. Rather, they are improvised measures aimed at the West, which has consistently rejected the idea of a partnership with Russia. Essentially, Putin has been trying to show the US and the EU just how far he's willing to go to keep them out of his backyard, let alone his house. Given the economic and strategic costs that Russia has incurred, Wood judges the outcome a defeat for Putin. But on the other hand, Russia still is holding on to Crimea, the civil war in the Donbass is still going on, and the EU really is showing no signs of making a more serious bid to help Ukraine. So in your analysis, has Putin won or lost this conflict? Or are the results too mixed to declare a winner? What about the Ukrainians? Should they be angry at Russia, at the EU, or both? What resolution, if any, can you imagine for this situation? Number 6. Wood also analyzes the issue of Russia's interference in the 2016 US presidential election. And this is, here we're at something that, even if you're not a Russia watcher, usually this is definitely something that you heard about. He points out that while Russia did interfere through misinformation campaigns, there were many more significant factors that contributed to Trump's win over Clinton. Even so, he writes, quote, "For many liberals, it was more convenient, more emotionally accurate to blame Trump's ascent on an outside power and implicitly to identify Trump himself as a foreign body," end quote. And that's on page 142. So what are the consequences of this mindset for Russian-American relations? What are the consequences for domestic politics in America? Why does Wood reject the term New Cold War? In your analysis, how can we overcome this impasse, assuming Putin remains in power for the next several years? Or should we give up the pretense of cooperation and return to the old Cold War mindset of mutual enmity with Russia? Number 7. Let's turn to Putin's address by the President of the Russian Federation, which is the speech he gave after annexing Crimea in 2014. Make a close reading of the first 15 paragraphs. I know that's a lot, but there's a lot to unpack here, and it's all a little bit interspersed, so humor me and read that's about the first third of the speech. How does Putin use history to lay claim to Russia's ownership of the Crimean Peninsula? How might a Ukrainian nationalist counter his version of this history? And what questions might we have about the way that he tells the story as historians ourselves? How does Putin's use of history for political purposes help us think about the stakes of local histories? Number 8, considering this same passage, in the same part of the speech, how does Putin instrumentalize the history of the Crimean Tatars? Do you get the sense that Putin really cares about the Tatars and their issues? If you were a Tatar, would you support Putin based on this speech or not? Number 9, according to Putin, how has Russia behaved toward Ukraine since 1991? He even claims to sympathize with the Maidan protesters. But would he be so sympathetic to this kind of protest if it happened in Russia? And, is he really sympathetic to the Maidan protesters at all? Is he sympathetic to Ukraine? What vocabulary is Putin using here to delegitimize the revolutionaries, even as he's claiming to, understand what it is that they're getting at? In other words, how is he sort of positioning himself as a friend of Ukraine, as a friend of the protesters, but in a way that legitimizes Russia's claims to Crimea and to a sort of a sphere of influence kind of status here? Number 10. Putin also raises the issue of international politics. He raises the examples of the West's behavior in relationship to Kosovo, the color revolutions, NATO expansion, and the issue of weapons of mass destruction. That's quite a list. What is Putin's overall point in all of this? How does he understand the West's behavior, or how does he characterize it? How does this offend him as the president of Russia? How does it give him permission to undertake his own actions? Clearly, Putin is scoring political points here, but is he entirely wrong? Given its own record, does the West have a solid basis for opposing the annexation of Crimea? Why or why not? Okay, those are my questions. I'm going to get this video posted.